Hello, I'm Jeff Jones and welcome to Admin by Request EPM Feature Deep Dive Settings, How Making Them Work Works. And this is part one, so the intro and the global settings and basic subsettings. So I do a few of these webinars and usually they are all about an exciting new feature or new version that we're releasing. So you may be slightly surprised that the webinar today is really simply about settings. So what is so exciting and notable about settings? Well, actually there is some inspiration behind this webinar on subject, and that is that I've been going to various trade shows this year, and the more recent one in Singapore in October, I had we do get numerous people coming onto the stand interested in an EPM because they don't have an EPM and want to understand how admin by request can solve problems that they have. However, I had quite a large number of people coming onto the stand that already had an EPM and wanted to consider switching over to admin by request. So that was quite interesting, and I made a note whenever I spoke to anyone of these people inquiring as to the reasons why they wanted to switch to admin by request. So you're probably thinking, why do people switch, or why do people want to switch from their existing solution over to admin by request? So is it about cost? Well, from the discussions I had, no, not really. They originally selected their EPM. Now, admin by request is famously highly competitive in compared to other solutions, and they could afford the solution they have. So probably cost wasn't an issue when they purchased their system, so it wouldn't be a reason to switch, I don't think. What about performance? We have, I don't think we don't probably make enough noise about this really, but one of the big benefits of admin by request is the endpoint agent takes virtually zero resource overhead on installed endpoints, and that is definitely not the case with many competitor solutions. So this is very notable and to come up in conversations. However, it is more, or seem to be more, of a general annoyance for users that perhaps they worked around, they maybe upgraded laptops, or maybe some people or developers maybe got an opt-out because they simply couldn't work with the slowdown. So yes, annoying, but again, I don't think that was the main reason that prompted them to come up and talk to me on the stand. Overwhelmingly, it was ease of configuration and management. So that is kind of maybe surprising, but the general story of what happened in most of these cases is that they looked at their current EPM, they went into a POC with it and it kind of seemed okay. Then they did a pilot and again, it sort of seemed to work. But after even just a short period of actual real use, so after rollout, with requests for privilege coming in from all angles, what happened in pretty much all these cases is that kind of mountains of spaghetti rules, as I call them, kind of built up as more and more rules and exceptions are put in, and after 6 months, which is not a fantastically long period of time, things kind of get so complicated, it becomes difficult to understand the implications of changing or making a change on the workforce. And one chap I spoke to said that when he made a change to the system, he would just dread the phone ringing immediately after, and if just by chance someone did phone up after, he would always assume that something had gone horribly wrong, which is not a nice way to kind of have to do your job really. So yeah, I kind of felt for him. So I have a bit of a catchphrase, which is complexity is a vulnerability. And what I mean by that is that if something gets too spaghetti-like to understand, then when it comes to security and compliance systems, misconfigurations create exceptions and exceptions create holes. And it's then when you realize the system is kind of self-defeating, not only for security and compliance, but also for productivity for the users too. So that is really the reason why I'm doing the webinar. And actually, speaking of spaghetti and expensive disappointments, there is a analogy, and everyone loves a car analogy. And it kind of made me think, because another conference I did this year was in Milan, and I arrived at the airport and went to the car rental desk to collect the car that I'd booked kind of 2 months earlier. And I was told that unfortunately the car that I had booked was not available, and I had a choice. I could downgrade to a kind of old banger, or I could pay more and get something which is maybe a little bit sleeker and sporty. And actually, I needed to go to a remote place, so I did need something that was, kind of four-wheel drive. So I kind of almost felt a bit suckered, but I kind of had to go and do the upgrade, and so I was led out, to the yard, and what I saw, actually, I kind of felt that it wasn't too bad after all. A nice Italian car. So in this case, I didn't feel that the cost, even though it was a bit of a surprise, was an issue. So off I go in my Tonale, and after not long, I realised that when I put my foot on the accelerator to kind of pull away at the lights and stuff, nothing happens for like 2 or 3 seconds. So it's kind of like a lag, which was really annoying. And after a while, I ended up having to sort of kind of predict when I would need a bit of speed and put my foot on the accelerator before I needed it, which is really odd. But so that was a bit of a disappointment. But was it really was it really going to make me want to turn around and take the car back to the rental place? Not really. I was just kind of annoyed. But really, the problem started for me after we hit the motorway, because once we got on the motorway, I started getting tons and tons of these driver assistant aids kind of notifications. Like, it would tell me that I was my hands weren't on the wheel, when they were. So I ended up kind of gripping the wheel like I was on some sort of fairground roller coaster ride to stop that alert. And then I would get the kind of lane assist alert, which would tell me that I was leaving my lane when I wasn't. And then it was trying to kind of pull me back towards the center line, and the steering wheel would vibrate, and the actual wheel would actually steer me into the path of oncoming kind of lorries, which is kind of really scary. So I didn't like that at all. And then there was the approaching the speed limit alert, which is really odd because it was just constantly going off, and I wasn't doing over the speed limit. I was just approaching it. I knew what the speed limit was, and it was just constantly telling me you're approaching the speed limit, and it was just infuriating. So when I got to my destination, I spent about 2 hours trying to reconfigure the car and turn all these kind of aids off, and it really just, in my view, kind of destroyed the driving experience, and it did make me a bit kind of angry, really. So it was very, very frustrating, and it was kind of like this whole thing about it wasn't cost, it wasn't really performance, but the manageability of this, the experience of use of this machine, when really I just wanted something good to drive. The experience should have been so much better. So I just thought that was a kind of interesting analogy. And admin by request, we have this free plan, and what kind of struck me is that most people on our free plan, the great thing about it, it's super intuitive, and people can just jump in and they can kind of configure it, and it's quite easy to understand to get something out of it really quickly. And I think that's a massive USP for us. However, I've got a suspicion that many customers, they go in and they configure maybe the most intuitive setup, the most intuitive settings, but maybe they're not realizing the full capability of our configuration methodology. And I think it's really important to fully understand how our settings and subsettings work if you're going to get so much more out of the product, and it will make it even more of a joy to manage. And I'm always getting asked about comparisons between our product and other PAM EPMs. Usually people are after feature by feature. However, one thing that is I can realize now is that one of our biggest competitive advantages is our unique approach of how settings are managed and applied. Like the impressive array of buttons on the dashboard of my Tonali, features mean nothing if the actual driving experience is hard work. So the first part, which is this one, we've had our little intro. I'm then going to go on to explaining a little bit about global settings. And then after that, we're going to go and have a look at the most kind of basic form of configuring a subsetting, which is where you have a one subsetting that sort of associates with one group of user, and either you would configure that to override one particular setting from global, or you would completely populate all the settings in that subsetting and have it being what I would call a full override. So that's part one, this part. And then in part two, I'm going to cover some more I'd say sort of maybe advanced. I don't want to say advanced because that sounds complicated, but just maybe some more different scenarios and maybe surprising configurations of things that you can do with subsettings that maybe you didn't realize that you could do. And those terms, by the way, baseline plus and app control float, those two are kind of my own terms, so don't go repeating those to other people in our support department. Support assist is actually a product feature of ours, and account separation is kind of a bit similar. Well, it's kind of the same as support assist, and it is just a term, isn't it, for using a different account to do elevations from other than your logged in account. So anyway, that is the kind of brief intro to the webinar of part one. We're going to go now and have a good look at how to configure global settings. So let's have a look now at global settings and how global settings affect users. And that generally would be the case when you first implement using a free plan, because the global settings would be the main point of configuration. And we can see here, if we go to EPM settings, Windows settings, these are what I'm calling the global settings here. So let me just click on, actually I'm going to use this other window. So what the setup is this: I'm going to be using the left hand side to show parts of the portal, and the right hand side I'm going to be connecting to those to my test endpoints using our new secure remote access product as well. So I'm going to be doing all of this using the portal. So first of all, let's go into EPM settings and Windows settings here, and this gives you a very typical configuration for global settings. Run as admin mode, admin session mode are both enabled, but with approval enabled. And also I have configured in a pre-approval rule for the specific version of Notepad++, meaning that the user should be able to run or elevate this installer without needing the approval which we've configured in authorization. So let's go and have a look at that straight away. So I'm going to go and click into this here, and then I'm going to go and what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to just, because it always looks nice, I'm going to share my phone as well, so you can get just a feel of how we access things using the secure remote access. So if I just it's just an authenticator always does that. Hang on a second here, let's shrink you down, move you over here. So I'm going to hit the remote button in the portal because I've got secure remote access enabled for this endpoint, and I'm going to hit remote control, which is the unattended mode, as opposed to remote support, which is more of a screen share. So remote control unattended, I click on this, and it's going to require me as the person logged into the portal to do the MFA. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to type in my password here, and then I'm going to challenge me to authenticate. It's done. And now I'm going to be logging into this endpoint with some credentials that are domain credentials. And what we should see when we're logged in as this user, so if I go about, you'll see connectivity, it's all good. We should, if I go to the inventory screen, I might actually just duplicate this tab here as well. If I go to here, let's just move the phone off for the moment, don't need him anymore. If I go to this endpoint on the inventory, you'll see we have automatically collected all this information, which is very good, part of our inventory system. We get the full software load, what software is installed on this computer, including version, install date, size and bits, and then we have what is really useful for us, in particular for this demo, are the groups, the user groups this user is a member of, and the device groups as well. So we're going to be using these groups later on in subsettings, but at least now we know which user and device groups this user and this computer is a member of. So back to global settings, and I'm going to, we don't have a scope set. So what that means is that without a global scope, as we discussed earlier, these settings will apply to all the endpoints that you've deployed out through using the installer from this tenant. So if I try to start an admin session, for example, it's going to request me for approval. So I need admin session, please. I hit OK. I then would go to requests. I approve. And then we get the approval in, and you can see my admin session will now start like so. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, so next I'm going to look at that pre-approval rule, which I believe was for 795, this version. So I should be able to start or run this elevated without going through approval. I can. Very good. But if I tried to elevate or install another, it would take me through the approval process. So you can see this is working exactly as expected. However, I now want to go and put a global scope in, and I want to make sure that I don't put a group in that the user is a member of. And I know I've got a group called ABR-users, and this user is not a member of that group. So I'm going to go and put my scope in to ABR-users. Okay. So now what I'm going to have is I'm going to get a little warning that comes up in global settings, which tells me I have a global scope configured, and that anyone that is not in that user group, we're going to get the pin code and will not be able to perform any elevations at all on the endpoint without a pin code. So if I try again with the admin session, again I get denied. If I try a run as admin, it denies me. Now with pre-approvals it works a little different. You'll still get denied, but initially you'll get a yes no, so you'll think actually you're okay, but if I hit yes, again you get denied. So I can't do anything as a user if I'm out of global scope with admin by request unless I have that pin code. Let's go back to inventory, and we can go and have a look to see groups, and we can see that there is domain computers here. So I mean I could put domain computers in as a global scope, so I could do that. Maybe computers in group like so. if I had, by the way, enter, I think it's all devices or something, I could put that under here. So where you have two groups in the same box, that becomes a logical or. If I was to have ABI users in this box for users, and then domain computers or all devices in this box, entering groups into, or entering things into two separate boxes becomes an and. So just bear that in mind. Multiple things in the same boxes are ors, things in different boxes become ands. So let's save that. And again, if I hit refresh, or just go here and hit refresh, it should update the warning to say domain computers. And if I was to now do an admin session, because this computer is in the domain computers group, you can see I'm now able to do the elevations, and that would include admin session, running something as admin, getting approval, and then that pre-approved will now work as well. Okay, so that is a really good example of where to use global settings, how global settings work, what the global scope is for. Remember, when you're troubleshooting, why if users are, or computers are ending up in global settings, you can see them in the audit log. They'll be shown under settings, global settings. So it's always a good thing to see if indeed computers are getting having those global settings applied as opposed to a subsetting instead. I think the next part of our demo now, we're going to move on to cover subsettings and different scenarios. It's important to still keep an understanding of global settings and how they relate to subsettings. You can, as we'll see in the next part of the demo, have a global fully configured as a kind of baseline, and then configure a subsetting to override just a single setting, and then you would then configure everything else from global settings. But naturally, if you want to follow the best practice, it's really to have global settings as sort of like a hard default, where you'd have either elevation modes turned off, or you might even have a global scope in there, so that only the computers or users that are members of certain groups even get the ability to have those global settings applied. But anyway, that is pretty much all for global settings. Let's move on now and do subsettings. So let's take a look at subsettings and the fundamentals first. Subsettings are used when you want to override some or all global settings for groups of users and or computers. So if you have, for example, your global settings are all configured, and you have another group of users that you, for example, just want to change a single setting for, aside from what you've already set in global, you can create a subsetting simply that sets that single override from global, so you don't have to replicate all the global settings again to get that behavior, that configuration to that group plus the change. So you're really just using a subsetting commonly as kind of like a delta of what the difference is between global and your subsetting. There's no limit on the number of subsettings you can create, although I'd recommend that you would try and keep the number down simply from a manageability point of view, but you're not ever going to get a kind of warning or any sort of limit when you create those, so you can go ahead and create as many as you like. You do require, for Windows systems, that is the case anyway, a directory join or registration. And this is because subsettings will use groups or OUs in order to scope and fit users' computers into those subsettings. I say it's not quite the same for Mac, because with Mac we have something called a policy file that allows you to specify in that file a kind of virtual group name. If that Mac is not directory joined, it can kind of emulate a group, and you'd send that policy file out by MDM, and get access to subsetting sort of functionality without actually being registered, and that's only functionality that is on a Mac. And finally, if multiple subsettings match, they are applied top down. This is kind of difficult to explain, so I think I'm just going to cover this in the demo part of the next bit. One-to-one subsetting to group with partial overrides and global settings. Okay, so let's take a look at a one-to-one subsetting to group with partial overrides and global settings. So what I mean by a one-to-one subsetting to group is that I can create a single subsetting and I'm going to map that to a group of users. So I'm not going to those users aren't going to have other subsettings that they're putting in configuration for. It's simply a case of one group of users to one subsetting, and it is probably the simplest form of creating subsettings in admin by request, which is probably a good place to start. And actually it's partial override, so we're going to create the subsetting and we're going to be overriding just a few settings from global as that kind of delta change. So this is the kind of starting point. So let's just recap where we are at with this setting. So we looked at the global settings, we configured approval, we set a scope for domain computers, we also created a pre-approval rule for 795 version of Notepad++. So if we look on the endpoint here, you can see that here's 795. I can run that without going for approval. 782, it needs approval, and then of course if I want to do an admin session, that will also need approval. And maybe for the user Adam, I want to, one other thing as well I forgot is that we created a lockdown blocking rule to prevent people that get global settings from running or even requesting system files that way. So imagine that our user Adam is a developer. So let's have a look at his, he's logged into this system here. So we can have a look at his groups and we can see that he is a member of a group called ABR Senior Dev. So it would be a good idea to create a subsetting based on that group membership. So we're going to go to the subsetting menu of EPM settings. And now we're going to create our first subsetting. And I'm going to call the subsetting using the name of the group, which is kind of straightforward. I'm going to hit update. Now when you create a subsetting, by default it's not active, so you'd have to go in and activate it. We haven't assigned it a scope group yet, so we're going to do that straight away. So what this means is that any user that is a member of this group is going to pick up the subsettings. And I'm going to hit save. Good. I can now go back to the list of subsettings, and if all is well, you can see my subsetting is now grey, so it means it's active. And if I break that open here, you can see the group name that it is scoped on, and this link is very useful. This tells you who in your tenant matches the subsetting. So if you make a change to the subsetting, who's going to have that change applied to them. So if I click on the link, it'll run a report and show me that indeed Adam is a member of the subsetting because he matches. So if I click on his endpoint here, we now have a new button called subsetting, and that button shows us if any subsettings are matching, and indeed this one is. So that's the first thing, is to get the match made. But obviously if we go and look at the subsetting in question, you notice that everything here is grayed out. And what that means is that nothing is overridden from the global setting. So in essence, nothing is going to happen at all. So by putting no overrides in, you're basically just creating a sort of a skeleton of a subsetting that's not actually doing anything. You have to override things on the subsetting for it to have any impact. So we're going to turn off approval. So to do that, we're going to click on Overall Global Settings, and we're going to turn off approval, and why not turn off the reason, just for argument's sake. Let's just do that. And we did mention that we want to remove the block on system file, so we're going to go and turn off that block as well. So let's just review that. So if I go back to the subsetting list, you'll now notice that we have the subsetting is active. We've changed something in the auth component, which is the approval is off, reason is off, and we've also changed the component in the lockdown part of subsetting. So you can see here that anything set here is going to get overridden from global settings. Anything not set here will go through and the global settings will apply. So let's have a look now on the endpoint. If I run a session request, I no longer get approval, I get the code of conduct. I can hit OK, and that works very nicely indeed. I can remember we still have that pre-approval, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if I was to go and run this file again, I don't get approval because we turned it off. And finally, I can elevate this file, the command prompt, as admin. It's a system file, but we've allowed system files to be elevated for this group of users. So again, this works fine as well. So let us have a little look then at what is going on with pre-approvals here, because we put a pre-approval rule in global settings. If we can have a look here, and in app control, you will see here is the pre-approval. It's been put up in the very top level, so global settings. So unlike settings for endpoint and lockdown, malware and data and emails, the settings in app control cannot be overridden in the context that you can't stop anything put in app control from inheriting downwards to other subsettings. So if we go into this subsetting here and then go into app control, which is grayed out, you might expect to see that there is an override button here, but there is not. What you see is a pre-approval list for pre-approvals for this subsetting, and of course whether or not pre-approvals are enabled at all. And you also see pre-approved applications that have been inherited from global settings. So this is important because you need to consider when you put a pre-approval rule in global settings, it will go to every endpoint, every user of every subsetting, and hence the term global really is global in the context of app control, and the same can be said for blocking settings too. So with that in mind, really you should only really be putting things into global if you really mean them to be global. I mean pre-approvals and blocking and all that kind of stuff. So just be wary of that. The machine learning and approvals, they both have override settings, so you can switch those on and off in subsettings. That's fine. Trade tools doesn't have one, but then we don't duplicate trade tools. So if you put a trade tool in global and you just happen to put one into a subsetting, you won't get two. We dedupe that, so that works very nicely. So let's go and perhaps put in a pre-approval rule just for this user in this subsetting. So if easiest way to do that would be to go into the application log. Maybe we can go in and do a quick search. Oh no, we didn't do a search. We can just pick it up straight from down here. Rufus, break that open. There it is. And then we can just pre-approve. And now when we pre-approve from the audit log, we get a choice of where to put it. So we can put it into global for everyone, or we can put it into for senior devs only. And we're going to be pre-approving. We have a choice. We can do the specific hash and file, or we can do vendor. So that would be everything made by that company. Let's just go with that for now. Why not? So we put that pre-approval rule in, and you can see, so we have the Rufus vendor in for the subsetting, and then we have the global one in below. So if we look to see how that works, so again we have our global one we have here, which works fine, and we also have, where's he gone, here it is, so we can run the Rufus one as well, like so. And actually what I can do is I can, because we have the approval turned on automatically, there's not much difference really between a pre-approval rule. You don't get the code of conduct if you have that configured, but what I can do is I can turn off user confirmation, which means that for the pre-approval rule itself, we are not going to get that yes no prompt when we run the file. So if I try again now, you'll see we get a little splash down here, and then we get the Rufus application running as admin. So that's a little example of how to configure a subsetting so that just those few things override. And if I was to go back into global settings, now if you can imagine I had many subsettings all configured, and I wanted to make a global change. So I could go into endpoint, for example, look and feel, and I could change that to dark. And as long as I haven't set that setting in any of my subsettings, that setting will take effect on all the endpoints. So if I was to go and run this again, it's light grey, but then the second time I do it, it's going to appear to be dark because we've just pulled in the new settings. And that means that, I could, if I have a policy of setting certain settings only on global settings, then I can apply that policy to the entire estate without having to go into every single subsetting and make that change individually. So I think that is one-to-one subsettings to partial overrides and global settings. I think I'll do the next one in this same bit of the demo, which really is one-to-one subsetting to group, so kind of similar, but with full overrides. And all that is, as the name suggests, is you, rather than have some overrides from global settings, you go through and you basically make all of the different sections of a subsetting to be overridden from the global. Okay, even if you don't change the settings, you go through and you override them. So why would you do this? Well, the reason why you might do this is that, let's say you have a very large organization and you've got people at the very top who are responsible for having the settings and the policies, and you've got a particular group of users or computers that you really do not want to ever be overridden by global for whatever reason. So you basically go through and you set all of these subsettings so that all of them are overriding. So you've got kind of a full override going on, so that if I go into malware, so that means I can have the same settings from global because we just picked them up, but I'm just forcing them to be overridden so that if someone does come along and change the global settings, it's not going to impact anything in the subsetting. Okay, so again, not sure if we have one in emails, but I think we do. So again, this is something that I guess it's got a very kind of bit of a narrow specific use case. Well, what I'm saying is that if you don't want a subsetting or members of a subsetting ever to pick up any setting from global under whatever circumstance, this is what you would do. You would go in and do the overrides for every single part of the subsetting. And what that means is that when a user is mapped to that subsetting, it's not going to pick up settings from any other subsetting below it, and it's not going to pick up any global settings either. You really are creating a true kind of one-to-one relationship. So if you're in a certain group, you get these settings and nothing else. And that concludes the first part of our Admin by Request EPM feature deep dive, settings, how making them works. I hope you have a better understanding now of how global settings work, and also that we covered those two more basic configurations for subsettings and mapping a group of users to a subsetting. In part 2, we'll cover 4 slightly more interesting configurations, so I'll catch you in part 2. Bye for now.